Hold on.
Okay, so I guess we're gonna get started. Good evening, everybody. Greetings, welcome. Welcome to Stop LAPD Spying Coalition's first Tuesday of the month Know Your Fight webinar. This is part 45 of our webinar series that has been going on since middle of or late March last year. As our organizing has been going, the first Tuesday is committed to this webinar to look at the intersection of national security, police state, and gender and sexuality, and how it impacts our communities. And Today, of course, our comrade Chella Coleman will be facilitating that. I just want to do a quick welcome on behalf of the coalition and also do a quick logistics check-in as well, that when you all checked in, that the mics were muted. And of course, we're not trying to police anybody's voice or comments, but we've been Zoom bombed. So that's happened. Similarly, chat is going to host only, but please feel free to send us a message through chat, or also there's your raise your hand. Just function as well in the chat. And this is being recorded, or you can just like on your screen raise your hand as well. And of course, as we continue with the conversation, at some point we're going to unmute the mics for this to be a more collective conversation. So with that, I am going to pass it over to Chella.
Well, hello, welcome. Thank you for coming, y'all. Okay, so tonight's conversation is going to be around liberation and for trans, especially for those at the margins of it, Black trans women, Indigenous trans folks, Two-Spirit folks. We have some folks on this line, and there's another person that will be joining us when they come. We will be introducing them. So I'm going to let the people speak for themselves. The only person here right now, besides me, I'll talk about myself first. My name is Chella. I've been an artist and an activist and organizer around Skid Row and in Skid Row. As y'all can see, I still live here in Skid Row for the last 8 years. My focus has been primarily on trans Black women, especially those who've been impacted by, housing and or prison industrial complex. I've been doing work with Stop LAPD Spying for the last 7 years, 6 or 7 years. And my pronouns are she and they. So that's me. Hoey, you're more than welcome to introduce yourself now.
Imanaja Mashikuna, Nukaka Joy Mikani, Nukaka Piama Majakta Matamikani, Donli Mapaku Kukuna Mandamikani. Hello, friends. My name is Joy. I come from a community called Walopihao. We're an Andean community. I, as well as, am one of the founders of Indigenous Peoples Movements, as well as a local organizer here in South Florida. That being said, Indigenous people were very diverse from Canada to Argentina. Los pueblos originarios are really diverse. We all have different cosmovisions, so I will not be able to do justice to every single community, but I hope to be able to give you guys an idea of some of the fights that we were having in Abya or in Turtle Island, or however different communities refer to the lands that we're currently on. Currently, I'm on Seminole Miccosukee land, and I want to acknowledge that.
Thank you, Hoey. And in LA, we are on Tonga land. I totally forgot to acknowledge that. With respect to the native folks here, Tonga and Quiche is what I've been told, so I'm going to say those names. The rest of the folks are not here, so I'll just get started with Hoey. My first question to you is, how has the political climate, especially with what happened in DC, affected the Indigenous folks, especially Two-Spirit and queer and trans folks? Yeah.
When you say DC, what exactly do you mean?
What happened in DC a few weeks ago? The white insurrectionists going into, the White House.
Yeah, so with that, I mean, we saw what was going on, and to us, it was kind of comical. we just kind of minded our own business when it came, or a lot of us kind of minded our business just because it had nothing to do with us. That was a white people battle as we saw it. And so we kind of just minded our business when it came to that type of stuff. We do want to acknowledge that there is Native people in DC fighting to get recognition on that territory. Outside of that, the things that DC, it really didn't really affect us because, it was just something that the fascists in this country were kind of doing.
Do you see a difference?
There was this one thing, I guess, but this is more on a cultural level where there was this one guy with a coyote skin. I will say that was more, again, it wasn't like super pertinent to indigenous people throughout the Americas, but I guess it was just like, it was comical because he was talking about how in the Dene community, the coyote was seen as wisdom or things like that. And if anyone's ever spoken to a Dene or an Inde person, you'll know that the coyote is a death omen. So, it was a white guy wearing clothing that represented death omen. So, he said he got that inspired by the Dene people, and Dene people just in general were just kind of laughing because it is a death omen is what he was wearing.
How did you see the difference between how the government treated Two-Spirit folks, like during the whole Standing Rock and other pipeline movements and other Native Indigenous movements, and how they treated white folks when they stormed the Capitol?
It was frustrating in that regard because when we're protesting, we're met with hose, we're met with the army, and we're talking about just elders protesting, children protesting to be on our territories. Yeah, when white folks literally go into the Capitol, a government building, they're kind of just walking in, prancing in even, and just kind of taking stuff, selling it on eBay. And it was just kind of like, it was white privilege at its finest was what we saw. And it's frustrating because what we're fighting against is, our waters being polluted. What they're fighting is a bunch of conspiracies. So.
Thank you for saying that. Hamid, the other speaker just came in. Can you?
Sure.
Can you? Okay.
Yes.
So welcome, Michelle. Can you tell us your name, your gender pronoun, and what do you do in, the social justice world? Oh, okay. Are they there?
Yes. Okay, Michelle.
Hey, gorgeous.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, love the lipstick. Introduce yourself, your name, your gender pronoun, and what you do in the work.
Yes, hi everyone on here. My name is Michelle. Sorry for being late. For access purposes, I am wearing a black shirt with stripes that are in squares, blue lipstick, and my hair is, a little bit wavy over almost touching my shoulders. And I'm wearing glasses and earrings. I do a bunch of different things, but the most of the work that I'm doing right now is with this organization called Trans Latina Coalition, which is an organization here in LA that provides services to trans, gender nonconforming, intersex folks in the city and county of LA. And along with that, make, sexual liberatory music for trans femmes. I co-host a party called Trans Celestial, which is a mutual aid party for BIPOC, unhoused, and displaced folks. And and I lead this monthly effort, food distribution and mass distribution to folks across the city as well. So a bunch of different things, but excited to connect with people on here. Thank you for inviting me, Chela.
I just muted myself. I meant to mute myself during the conversation. So I'll be doing that throughout. I wanted you on here because number one, I know the work you've done. And number two, one of the things that I know you've done in the last, do you want to tell us about last year and the win that y'all just had
Yeah.
With the specific, yeah.
Yeah. So there were a couple different things that happened last year. But most of the work that I do with Trans Latina is specifically related to policy and statewide legislation. And so we had two big wins last year, one more controversial than the other. But one is we passed this bill that was called the Transgender Wellness and Equity Fund, which is a bill that basically created a pot of money within the Department of Public Health in the state that funnels resources to cities and counties across the state to create health resources for trans people. And like that is health resources in kind of a broad context. So it's like health resources literally to like healthcare clinics, access to hormone therapy, access to mental health therapy, but also like holistic health services. So addressing like the other needs that folks have, like housing, like workforce development, like all of these other things that contribute to folks' health in a like a holistic sense. And so we like passed this bill to basically like force the state to allocate money. And so right now it passed in September. And so right now it's going through the process of like that money being trickled down. And so it's been like a really complicated process. Like I've never worked with the state like that. And so it's very different. And there's a lot of trust issues that we have. But that was like a really big win we had last year. And I don't know if that's the one you were referring to, Chela.
Actually, that's not. I was referring to the other one, the AB. I don't know what the bill was called, but there was another win I remember happening, but it's okay.
Was it about for folks in prison?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So this one I just said was called AB 2218. Another bill that we worked on was called SB 132, which is Senate Bill 132, which is a bill that gives the autonomy and agency for trans folks within California prisons to be able to be housed in alignment with their gender identity. And this has like been a very like a more controversial kind of win, just because for me as an abolitionist and for like many folks that are abolitionists, you know, the goal isn't to make friendlier prisons. Like that really isn't the goal, is to have spaces be inclusive for our people. And that really isn't my goal either. But when I think about, you know, really advocating for folks that are inside, it's for me, policy and for me, bills like this one are a form of harm reduction. And for people that are facing so much violence, both sexually and physically in prison, what does this bill mean for allowing people to live another day in safety? Not to say that they're not going to experience violence in a women's prison, but for them, if they feel that they would be safer there and it's going to prevent violence, how is that a form of harm reduction while we get to our larger goal of burning down the prisons or ending incarceration? And so that one's been like, you know, always open to talk, like discussion and talk about that one, because I'm always still wrapping my head around it. But all I know is that, you know, in all the letter writing that I've done to folks inside and comrades and folks I have in prison, they're all saying that this is something they wanted and needed. And for me, as someone that's not incarcerated right now, how do I honor that and really support what they need and their vision right now?
Yeah, you just bring up a real good point. We actually were talking about this last Tuesday. We had a talk on abolition, right? And a person, I forgot which one was it, Hamid, that was talking about the difference of using with the end goal being reform and reform being used as a tactic to get to abolition, right? There are two different things, right? Like you just said, we have folks in prisons, in jails now. So we have to like, and they're the ones that, you know, we have to like, when we talk about abolition, especially abolition of prisons and detention centers, we have to center their voices when we can. By the way, they also are a part, well, they do letter writings to trans and queer inmates, right? Michelle, right? Yeah. So I thought that was just, you know, I just want to put that out. Howie, what are some of the issues, especially lately with COVID, but not only the COVID situation, but with Biden being elected, what are some of the struggles that you've seen Two-Spirit, specifically Two-Spirit and trans folks and queer folks go through? I'm sorry, Joey.
I mean, I guess you can say that it really isn't pertinent to the LGBT spectrum. What we are seeing is one of the cabinet members being Deb Haaland, which is the first Indigenous person to be in said position. The issue we're having right now is, I guess the discourse that is happening in Indian country right now has to do with Deb Haaland's role with anti-Blackness. There has been she signed on a bill that basically made it harder for Afro-Native people to get to remain recognized within their tribes, especially and specifically the 5 civilized tribes when it comes to freedmen. And for those of you that don't know, the 5 civilized tribes were slave-owning tribes. While majority of Native Americans did not do this, there are 5 specific tribes in the United States that did own slaves, specifically and especially the Chickasaws. And so a lot of freedmen within those tribes are fighting Deb Haaland because she signed on a bill, because she comes from a community that didn't own slaves. So and in fact were enslaved by the Spaniards. And so she doesn't understand how it affects Black Native people within different tribal groups. And so we're seeing that. Another issue that we're having is that Biden was deemed, or he refers to himself as the architect for this thing called Plan Colombia, which particularly targeted leftists in Colombia, campesinos, indígenas, Afro-Colombians, and killed them. We're talking about 2 million people being displaced in Colombia and around 800,000 Colombians dying because of this Plan Colombia. And now he's the president. And so this will affect Two-Spirit people or LGBT people within these communities. However, because when people talk about indigeneity or nativeness or whatever, they don't really refer to specific communities within those communities. It usually affects the tribe. And so a lot of us are just looking at Biden right now and saying, okay, well, Deb Haaland isn't listening to Afro-Indigenous people in the United States. She's kind of just been like, oh, oops, kind of response. And then we're having to deal with a president who looks at the third world and funds these anti-leftist paramilitaries, and especially in Colombia, where fascism is on a rise and on the upscale, is very dangerous to be in a third world country under Biden. But the liberal media will of course paint Biden as the victor, as someone who we should praise and stand behind, ignoring his imperialistic policies. And again, he deems himself the architect for Plan Colombia. And he says that he wants to do that in the rest of Latin America. So these are the things that a lot of, I guess you could say, trans and LGBT people are looking at, because again, we are part of a community. We don't necessarily see ourselves in a very individualistic manner that a lot of Americans here in the United States do. We think of our communities, and in my pueblo, we're 60,000 people. So in Colombia, so how does Plan Colombia going to affect us when we are historically communist, leftist, etc.?
Thank you, Joey. What about Misha? What about same kind of question? How has the political climate affected trans folks, and particularly trans undocumented folks, and GNC undocumented folks?
Yeah. So I think for a lot of people, are winded by like what's happening and the celebration and commotion that's been happening around this election and this inauguration, which is, understandable. I think that people are going to, in this dystopia that we're living in, people really find this to be a really huge win, and that the world is going to change and that everything is going to get better. But one of my friends has been like periodically posting this like live posting every day, like day 14 of Biden in office and ICE still isn't dismantled, right? And so for people, like I think that says a lot. I think that there are a lot of things that people there are a lot of false promises that are made with politicians, you know, and things that are done in terms of political actions that are really seeming to be liberal. Like, for example, like creating this like pathways to citizenship and this like the things that he's doing with DACA and all of these things that people see as really are definitely helpful, but are only like a band-aid to the larger problem of like the current immigration system in the US. And so I think with most like presidents and all like politicians, it's all going to be like really small incremental like things that are going to be changed and happening that aren't really like addressing the root causes of people's needs, like financial assistance for undocumented folks, like no like halting deportations, like all of these different things that are still happening that are impacting our people and impacting our community. And so I think people are really celebrating, I mean, obviously, yes, celebrating that, you know, Trump is out of office and things, but we only like got a lesser evil, but still evil, you know? And so I think that for our communities, especially folks that, you know, come into our center every day and folks that are our community members or siblings that aren't documented. Like one of my good friends, I'm not gonna say her name, but she literally like is getting deported like next week. And we were like trying to raise funds for her so she can survive when she gets back and get everything that she needs as she leaves. But it's like none of that is stopping with the new president. And I don't think people are really realizing that and are taking these like only small steps that they're pushing forward that people are taking as like, oh my gosh, the world is changing. But no, our people are still like, you know, being put in situations that are putting them in so much violence and are still facing so much violence. And it's just like really interesting to see that happening. And like sometimes I feel like I'm living in different worlds than a lot of people.
You know, you bring up a good point, both of y'all. I was so to be real, I was watching a documentary on the right last night. Like, I don't know, something possessed me. And I was like, at the end of it, I'm like, what the fuck did I just watch? And you know, it was just funny to like watch three right wing, you know, Nazis pretty much, you know, talk about how they weren't Nazis, how they're not the ones that incited the violence in Charlottesville a few years ago, how they're not the ones that incited the violences that have been going on. And then I also think about, so there's I'm not going to name them. There's a person with Black Lives Matter that I saw on Instagram this morning. And they're like, queer and trans Black people voted for Biden. And we're so thankful. And it was just like, my mouth dropped. I said, the fuck, like on the post, just being honest. Sometimes I keep it real. Y'all don't like it. Oh, well. I said, the fuck. Like, no, he is not my president still. I don't believe in having a president. That's a colonial idea. But anyway, I was just thinking about how like the like lesser, even though like term lesser of two evils, it just I loved when you ended it with he is just still evil. Why do you think it's so easy for our communities, both of y'all? Why do y'all think it's so easy for our communities to overlook like the shit? Like there's a lot of Black and brown people that have Biden and Kamala Harris on their Facebooks. So many of them that are my friends too. Like, and I'm like, oh my God. Why do y'all think it's so easy for them to overlook the genocide that the Biden has like seriously supported? And he's also said some really anti-Black racist shit. Why do y'all think it's really easy for us to overlook the bad things he's done? Howie or Michelle?
I think because we live in a first world country, there's a lot of I'm gonna be real, like there's gonna be a lot of comfort that happens here, even with indigenous people. Like I would love to say that Native people in the United States are, you know, fighting against these institutions, but a lot of times Native people here are not. Why? Because there's this comfort that happens when you live in this first world country. You look at what Deb Haaland and other indigenous politicians are pushing, and it's like bare minimum representation politics, as opposed to like, let's say in Mexico, Marichui, the first indigenous woman to run for presidency, was saying that she wants to be president, not because and she wouldn't accept the pay that the president gets. She's gonna allocate those monies, those funds to people around Mexico, specifically in indigenous communities, because for her, it wasn't the position that mattered. She needed help. She needs the help to help her communities, and they're pushing real changing the structure of Mexico. For example, in Guatemala, the first Mayan or the second Mayan woman to ever run for president, and she was flat out a communist. She was saying, "I'm a communist. We need to do these things. We need to give funding for pregnant women because Maya children end up working on the streets because parents can't afford to not have them work on the streets." These are the type of things that people are pushing in Latin America. These people are pushing Latin America. And unfortunately, here in the United States, what people are pushing for is, let's have a list for missing murdered indigenous women, which is an important issue. It happens throughout the Americas. Unfortunately, indigenous women and two-spirit people are being killed and disappearing, and no one cares. It happened in Peru and in Colombia, especially in Colombia. And yet, here, what they're trying to do is create a list for the police to kind of be able to watch and control, giving more power to the police state. And so I just think there's a comfort that happens when you lived in the first world, where you don't get to see the fight that happens in Latin America or in Africa or Asia. You just live comfortable here. And Latinos do this, Native people do this, even people from Latin America who are indigenous that migrate here get comfortable. You lose identity. You tend to be apoliticized because the United States wants to create an empire that is diverse. They want Black people to be sending bombs to the Middle East. They want Latinos to be deporting other Latinos in ICE. You look at who is working as these border agents, and the numbers is predominantly Latino. Then you have tribal councilmen who are selling the land, who, Standing Rock happened because the tribal council decided to give up territory to the government. That doesn't represent what the people wanted, and so the people fought. But the people were also fighting against their own tribal governments because, unfortunately, the money in the United States just makes people complacent. And so I think that's the reason, a big reason why it is easier to just vote for Biden and say, well, there you go. We won. We beat the bad, evil, orange man. Racism is done. Deportations are going to stop. We're not realizing that, Biden's president now, but today the first plane to Haiti that sent 60 plus Haitian migrants, deporting 60 plus Haitian migrants was sent today. 3 days ago, it was Jamaica during a pandemic. This was happening under Biden. And of course, no one should be surprised because under Obama, he was the reporter in chief. Trump couldn't even beat Obama during his first 4 years. And that's the reality, is that liberal politics tends to make imperialism, colonialism, racism, things like that just look prettier. And so that we in the first world are able to live comfortably and ignore it. At the end of the day, in the United States, all these things are being diversified. We're getting, it's just representation politics. And that's what the United States is focused on. And I think comfort is a big reason why that happens.
Yes. I think specifically about my mother, who she migrated here from Ecuador when she was 12. And she came here. It took her years to get her citizenship, like years. And, she fought hard, and she was like going through some bullshit in all those years that was happening. And now, like in more recent years, I find her like spewing this like anti-immigrant rhetoric. And I'm like, what? This makes no sense. Like, you literally are hating and talking shit on the same exact thing that you experienced and went through getting here and living in this country. And I think for me, a big thing that comes to mind is media consumption, and just how much of that really impacts our minds, hearts, bodies, spirits, and everything, and how much brainwashing happens on a day-to-day that we don't really realize when it comes from the news. Social media wasn't as big of a thing when she was like growing up, but definitely the news, and all of these different types of information that we get from the world that are all like pre-generated by the state, and all of these different things that the politicians be spewing out, all of the different things and ways that folks assimilate and be conditioned to think certain ways, even though that's the struggle that she experienced. And so I think for folks that are born here and folks that migrate here, I think Joey said this, like, folks like become depoliticized and start to think in the way that the US wants us to think for so many different ways. But I think that the media plays like a really, really huge role in this. And I think specifically like in terms of this specific election, I think it was really easy for people to just, you know, it was just so weird because like when with everything that was happening with the uprisings earlier in the year and the pandemic and everything, it feels like everyone forgot about that when the elections were happening, and he was saying the right language but not really understanding that there were like not any real commitments that were being made, and the demands that were listed in earlier in the year. I think people were really just focused on like, oh, okay, like we got this other person out of office and that was really the goal, and not thinking of further, okay, like I said, policy as a form of harm reduction. Okay, Biden, like let's say that's a form of harm reduction, getting this person into office, but that is not at all the goal of what we were aiming for. What if we don't even want a president to begin with? And I think people don't think that way yet.
So yeah, that what you said was really pertinent. Like, and I'm thinking about like with the black community, we call it the good Negro versus the bad Negro, the house nigga versus the field nigga, right? With immigrant rights, I've heard this like conversation around the good immigrant versus the bad immigrant, like the one that's sneaking in versus the one that comes here legally, you know, those kind of things. And those kind of things are harmful for our communities. And we take those on, right? We would take those conversations on. We take those beliefs on sometimes. I actually want to invite Byron into this conversation. Byron is an organizer. They've been organizing with me for the last few years during Queerpocalypse and taking over streets with me. You are muted, boo, but go ahead and unmute yourself and introduce yourself. Ah! Sorry. I'm so unprofessional, y'all. This is why I don't have a job.
Hi, everyone. My name is Byron. Thank you, Chela, for inviting me to be part of this today, and thank you, everyone, for being here today. Yeah, I like Chela mentioned, I organize different performance, actions, community-led events, and support in general. And I work with Hamid and the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition in different contexts over the last couple of years, if not decades. So it's good to be able to see folks and be in conversation with people like Joey and Michelle, who we know each other in different contexts. So now we're here having this conversation. Yeah, Chela.
Sorry. So my question that you can also talk on is like, and you know, Biden is president. Now what? Is it good? Is it bad? You know, what kind of things have you been seeing with, you know, the undocumented queer community, as well as like, you know, your own communities you work with?
Yeah, I think for me, you know, like I mentioned, working with the coalition, different contexts of the work that all of you do, for me, it's important to be able to build work outside of these institutions, right? Or to look work that it's looking into, like connecting to folks that are doing different kind of work in order to bring forth folks that get pushed to the margins, or folks that we just, you know, are assumed to not be contributing members of society. You know, like for example, having this space with you and these conversations. And then at least for me, in terms of just having lived in LA since being forced to migrate to the US, right? Having grown up here and seeing different communities, different queer spaces, different people come and go, it's important to create, just like work that truly challenges institutions. I feel like like having a wall and having that, there was a buildup for that didn't come out of nowhere. And I feel like we have seen for the last decades, or at least since I can remember, folks at the borders, undocumented, queer people, trans people, right? Like people who can be straight A students, people that have to work, people that have to be sex workers, people that are homeless, constantly time and again be faced with different policies, whether that is through immigration or through the police. And, you know, like that had been happening all the time. And, you know, Biden voted for that time and time again. Obama, you know, pushed forward those policies as well time and time again. So it's important to be able to understand the history and the context, right? And be able to build outside of that, not letting that just dictate the work that you do. So I'm glad to be able to see other folks here present, you know, like you mentioned, Chela, whether it's art, whether it's a protest, whether it's creating work that's specific to our own communities. It's, for me, it's important to be able to build work outside of all those institutional things that are set in place to, you know, to, as Joey and Michelle mentioned, right, to be disengaged or just feel comfortable with what we have.
Okay, good. I muted myself. Okay, good. I told you I'm unprofessional. Okay. So on a serious note, y'all, like something that's, I want to hammer this into folks' head, right? For queer and trans people, there is no kinder, gentler, there's no kinder, gentler oppressor, right? Do y'all think, and everybody can chime in, all the panelists, do y'all think, like, if y'all were interacting with an ICE agent that was a trans person, or ICE agent, or a police person that was a trans person or a queer person of color, would that be, how would y'all, do you feel that that would be better for y'all, or do you think it's just, I don't know, the same system? So, go ahead, Michelle.
Oh, you want to go first?
No, you can go first.
Okay. What I'll say is this: in our community, we have a word for police officer, and I've talked about Chela with this. I talked to Chela about this, and it's called auka, which means enemy, or person that puts your foot on you. And so for us, that's going to be the perception, right, of cops. And the reason why is because in my community, we're between the 3 major cities in Colombia. And so what they would do is they would send police officers or army people come, and they would hear someone speak a language and they would just kill them, or they would arrest them. And so, and the reason why they want to do this is because in Latin America, without a language, who are you? Without your language, you're not indigenous anymore. You're just mestizo. You're just un campesino, a peasant. Sorry if I use Spanish words. I'm sorry. I'm just so used to switching between the languages. But you're just someone who isn't indigenous anymore because you lose the language, you lose identity, and without that identity, you no longer care about the land you're on because you're just going to move to the city to get work. And this is how the police work, or the police force has worked in Latin America, to push mestizaje, to colonize indigenous people, to make us assimilate into the city culture, into the Castellano culture, or the mestizo culture, and just identify with the nation state. And then we move to the United States, and then we become border patrol agents, because it is, for us, it's easier to get resources by becoming a cop. Or, I mean, we're pushed really, a lot of us, to become cops here in the United States. I had cousins who really thought about becoming cops, and it became this huge controversy because in our culture, those are the enemies, those are the bad people. And yet there is this push because it's easy resources, right? And then you kind of want to prove yourself, and so you don't really care what community you come from. You're just going to do your job, and you kind of do it rougher, even more than white people do, because of that. Sorry, my dog is barking. And so, will I be more comfortable? No, because historically speaking, cops have been agents of the state. They unfortunately kill us. They unfortunately arrest us. And prior to 1492, we didn't have that. We didn't need cops. Now that white people rule our countries, it's so easy for them to say that we need the police. But ICE didn't exist until 2002. And yet people see it as a necessity. It's something that we need. We need to imagine society without these institutions, because in reality, if you look at the prison systems in the United States, with the exception of Hawaii, they're predominantly Black because of anti-Blackness, because the nation state sees Black people as almost an opposing force to the establishment of the United States. Hawaii is the only exception where they see indigenous people in Hawaii are the predominant people in prisons. And so if would I feel better seeing an indigenous person as a police officer or border patrol agent? No, because at the end of the day, they're giving up their identity to work for a state that oppresses people, that oppresses our communities. So personally for me, it doesn't make a difference, because it's just diversifying imperialism so that you can continue imperializing with, the first trans woman of color that is disabled is now able to send missiles. Like, how great is that,
Yes, Joey. Go ahead, Ms. Shay. You were gonna say something?
Can you repeat the question?
Is having a kinder, gentler police or an ICE agent, is that better for our community as trans, queer, GNC folk?
No, I think a lot about this. That one movie that Disney had come out with. I forget what movie it was, but there was this movie where the voice actor was this Black queer person, and they were playing a Disney character that was a police officer. And everyone was like, "Oh my gosh, like this is so amazing. Like the representation for our communities is so like we're screaming like this is so great." But it was just so bizarre that people are so much more infatuated with like what they just said of people really giving their identities and their labor over to a state that has harmed so many of our communities and our people. And I really struggle with this specifically because I get like this a lot of like, because I'm working in policy, and even then like that feels very like not even sure if this is work long term that I want to be doing, but definitely very grateful that I have the access to this knowledge, and I think is a tool for being able to work against it. But I think like a lot of the times folks are like, you should run for office, like there's hasn't been anyone like you in office before. And for me, I've always just had a really difficult time with that, because I'm just like, no, that's not even a goal of mine, like that's not even something I'm thinking about. Because I know for me, like, okay, yes, like my face, and kind of like for nonprofit organizations, right? Like you hire a trans person, they get tokenized, and you see this organization as like, oh, they're so inclusive. Kind of the same thing for the state and the government. Like you put this trans person into this elected official position, and it makes it seem like the world is getting better, and that the state is like this progressive like organization that is someone that we should support, when it's actually just utilizing your face and your name and your labor to continue doing all of the terrible things that it's been doing. Um, and so I share the same sentiments as what was shared as me before, but blunt answer is like, no, it doesn't matter the identities of these people that are holding these oppressive ass positions like police or ICE officers. It's really about how are we removing these systems of punishment that have been created in this world, and just decentering punishment as a whole, because I think punishment shows up in so many different ways in our world, in the carceral system, in the education system, in even in the healthcare system, and it just really shifts the way that we treat other living and human beings. And I think is the root. It's just like removing punishment.
Oh,
Um,
oh, go ahead, Byron.
I was just gonna share briefly that I have been detained, by LAPD officers, and they use like all of the reform and then like institutional stuff that was created in the past, in terms of like how to make it more safe. I don't know if that's the word that I would use, but that's the word they wanted to use, or more like friendlier for the LGBT community, right? So like me refusing to disclose to some random officer, right? Like how I identify in terms of my sexuality, my gender identity, even like HIV status. They were just asking all these very like questions that I was like, anywhere else, like not choosing to answer is a valid response, right? But for them, for their institution, it became like me being antagonistic, or like me, being like purposely challenging their authority. So again, I'm at least for myself, at least in LA, right? It's important for me to support the work that like Chella's doing, and like other folks like Michelle and Joey are doing in other parts of the country. We're looking into, they're very important needs that our community have, right? And they're very real situation as someone that hasn't been in jail, right? That other folks may face, and that yes, bring in some sort of changes that may be for now, right? But how do we then look beyond that and looking into work that isn't just equipping the state, right, to continue to replicate itself and like literally detain and exploit our communities and our bodies in different forms. Um, so no, not having them all those tools for them to be more friendly or like LGBT wasn't very helpful at all.
Yeah. I wasn't being rude. I was listening to everything you said. Thank you for sharing that, Byron. And fuck the pig. Fuck them. Which brings me to my next question, y'all. Like trans women, especially trans black women, and as you named Hoey, two-spirit women, two-spirit femmes and folks are being murdered or coming up missing. How do we stop these things? Like, what do we do? What can we do to stop these murders? What can be done in order for us to be safe? Um, I have my own thoughts, which I'll say at the end of all y'all's. If y'all don't say it. Go ahead. Anyone's likely able to say?
Yeah, I think a lot about resources and I think a lot about spaces. And when I think specifically about like trans people here in the city of LA, there aren't a whole lot of spaces that people can really find safety in. Yes, there are a lot of like collectives and there are different houses that folks, have to taking care of their own. But I think when we think about safe housing environments, when we think about safe like different services that people have access to in the city, there's not a whole lot. And I think that really um, impacts the ability for people to avoid violence when folks are forced to navigate the street, when folks are forced into these like really difficult times and places and situations. And I think at the same time, a lot of the time, Trans Latina Coalition, specifically the center that's located like in Mid City, a lot of the time is one of the only places that folks can get referred to specifically for like services, which is like really, really terrible. Like, super grateful that the org is doing this work and that, we're supporting so many people, but also like we shouldn't be the only org that has this capacity. Like, there are so many different collectives and orgs that have been doing this work for years. Like, Gender Justice LA and like other Black trans led orgs and collectives that have just not had the capacity to really expand and grow and continue to help all of the different people and our folks that really need the support. And so I think for me, when we create spaces or when spaces are created for people and communities, specifically trans people, it really shifts people's perspective on us, and it influences the culture when people are like, oh damn, like these trans people have a whole ass building, like they like, they deserve these resources. Like damn, I'm used to not even like knowing of a place for them. Like I'm used to like keeping their like not even talking about trans people. I'm used to them being in the media as, like depicted as like men, specifically for like trans women, and like people have these ideas, but if spaces were created for us that showed people that we're deserving of more than what we've been given, it can really shift the way that people perceive us. And there's a lot of it's a bunch of different things and methods, like the work that people are doing in the media, the work that people are doing to get resources. All of these different things kind of can shift the way that people perceive us. But I think at the end of the day, the root cause of a lot of the violence that so many of our people face is that people don't see us as human, and people don't see us as worthy of life and breath. And I think a lot of that has to do with just what we've been given access to over the years and years and years.
I want to say that we can tackle this so many different ways, and I think that we should tackle it in every way we can possibly think of. One of the ways I think would be effective is genuine education. What does transness looks like? What is a trans person? Things like this, because we're talking about not every person that is transphobic is college educated. Not every transphobic person just wants that is socially conscious of what's politically correct and things like that. Sometimes we're talking about poor communities that don't have access to these resources, so they just don't know. And so we have to be careful with how we word certain things to kind of humanize a group of people, because unfortunately, if we don't, then these resources will just never be allocated to, or this information will just never reach communities that just don't have access to it. In my family, my parents and my grandparents, they didn't go to school. The village that we come from, there was just no school. I'm the first one to go to school. And so when I start talking about certain things with them, they're going to be confused, and I have to word it in such a way that they know. And for them, indigenous communities in Latin America, I can go to neighboring communities like Quichuas, right? And I'll say, oh yeah, gay people and trans people. And they'll say, what? Gay, what is that? That's something that happens with the mashis, that's something that happens with the non-indigenous people. That's in the cities. Gayness doesn't exist in our communities. Trans people don't exist in our communities because they're raised or they don't see it, and sometimes it's even traditional to demonize these communities. A lot of people like to paint Native people as homogenous with the environment and super peace and ooh, and oh, we're just one with nature and we're so progressive when it comes to gender and sexuality. But where I'm from in Colombia, a pueblo en Bara, it's traditionally to kill trans women. It's traditional to kill gay people. And that's pre-1492. That's not because of Christianity, So when we say we need to decolonize our identities, we need to decolonize how we view trans people and gay people. Well, for that community, traditionally they killed gay people, they killed trans people. So how should we interact with that community, And what we need to do is we need to have resources, because there are trans women in that community that flee to the city, and it's a pandemic, or it's an epidemic in Colombia, where these people flee to the city and then they're killed by the state, because in Colombia, there's again, missing murder indigenous women. There's a huge nation state that wants to kill indigenous people, because then that's less people fighting for their traditional territories, for their homelands, and so we need to allocate resources to teach and to humanize trans people, because in so many different communities have different perspectives on what it is to be trans, what it is to be queer, gay, etc. And there are gay natives that are doing that around the Americas. We need to uplift those voices. We need to uplift those platforms, but as well as make the language accessible, because unfortunately, where I come from, it's not like my community is super woke, where a lot of people, a lot of my family members are poor. A lot of my family members, other people will call ignorant, because they don't have the resources that these communities, that pueblo mestizos may have, that communities who have resources may be able to attain. So we need to, not just that, but we need to also translate it to help these communities, Some of our people don't even speak Spanish. So what is trans? How do you say trans in Runashimi? How, these are general questions that we need to be asking ourselves. We need to translate it in a way that these communities are able to read or hear and listen and understand. And we need to be able to make sure that they know that it's okay to that they thought so a certain way for so long, because that's what happens with propaganda. We're fighting something that has been demonized for 500 plus years. Ever since the Spanish came and they started pushing this male, female, and straight, very Catholic way of looking at sexuality and gender. And then we also have to tackle the traditional communities that see it as a bad thing because of their own cosmovisions. These are the things that we have to do. And unfortunately, it's going to be hard, it's going to be rough, but we need to be able to make it in a way that is accessible to these poorer communities. Because if not, what ends up happening is trans people are forced to migrate from their cities, from their communities to the cities. Then they end up losing identity, because that's just what happens in Latin America.
Thank you, Hoey. Byron?
Yeah, I definitely want to echo, definitely, or at least build off of what Joey was just saying now, in terms of like accessibility. Yeah, and just how do you, like, for me, and being in different organizing spaces or different like activist spaces, yeah, just how do we make stuff more accessible for folks, whether that was like the language that's being used, whether that's like the time of our meetings, whether there's just the expectations of the work, right? But over the last couple of months, pretty much, I've been able to work with the Trans Latino Coalition as an interpreter, and doing. I mean, the space has always been bilingual, given the demographics and in this population. But as the work the organization continues to grow, right, it's important to make it more English and Spanish accessible. And then through that, Tela is really great at languages. I enjoy spending time with Tela for that other reason as well. And then Tela is also an ASL interpreter. So for me, right, it's whether something like for myself as using gender neutral languages in Spanish that folks may not be maybe not new, or they would just be not as accessible, right? But how do we then able to push back and do that, some of that exposure, some of that work, even if it makes it harder to interpret or coordinate. And then also just in terms of like looking at language justice, right? And when we create meetings or when we create spaces, because I work with another group in LA. They're a little bit big. They're a little bit known, so I'm not gonna really say or talk about them right now, but they're another group, right? And they want to do language justice work. And, it's a different group. It's not, it's not founded by monolingual Spanish speakers or people who are connection to that community, right? So they talked about like, it's language justice, or in other spaces that Chela and I have found ourselves in conversation, because, people want to hear about queer identity or trans experiences, or just like a different lens, right? But at that point, it becomes pretty much like, as in other spaces, you're playing catch up, right? I find myself in spaces where I am interpreting, and I'm just helping everyone else catch up, because English is still the dominant language, right? Or the different jargon and vocabulary. So again, I'm glad to be able to build with monolingual trans Latino women in spaces like the Trans Latino Coalition, but outside of that space, right? Whenever I find myself being invited to community events or different things, it's, we say like, oh yeah, but it's going to be accessible, it's going to be inclusive, and we list different things. But then, at the end of the day, at least in my experience, has been like me literally helping everyone else play catch up, because we're defaulting to something that makes us comfortable for a greater number of people, and that's usually defaulting to English. So that's what I want to talk about in terms of creating space and like being aware of the resources that are truly needed for different spaces, different communities.
Yeah, okay, I guess I will talk about it. So as someone who lives in Skid Row, right? Like Skid Row is it's the highest population of Black folks in LA. Let's just be real. It's also the highest population of policing in LA and in the US. Thinking like in like 2014, there was like $144,000 worth of money that went to the policing. So I'm answering my own question. This is not a question. Just answering, like adding to the pot of amazing things that y'all said. I think we can't just talk about like violence against trans women without talking about violence against women, cisgender women as well, right? Like we can't talk about one without talking about the other. Violence exists, right? Because these systems exist. These systems, they literally benefit from this. Police benefits from any time a person calls and they have a domestic abuse situation. Anytime my neighbors, let's keep it real, folks know, a lot of my neighbors deal with a lot of mental health issues. I deal with a lot of mental health issues. When they are called, they benefit from that, right? So we have to think around like transformative justice. We have to think about restorative justice practices instead of like, alternatives to 911 like YJC and Chukos is doing. Like, we have to think about those things. We all have to like learn about those things, learn about how to clearly and um, learn how to like resolve the issues, learn how to like look at conflict and know what's needed, and also know when to step away, right? I'm gonna be honest and say this morning I got woken up by one of my neighbors who was like having a fit. He literally threw a trash can over his stairs and like almost hit an older Chicana woman. And then I came back and I was like, yo, and like it's someone that I've talked to before because they caught the police on him before. And I don't want that with him again. And then earlier I was actually on a call actually I was on my therapist call with my therapist. And next thing you know, I hear my neighbor that lives right here popping off and like calling this woman a bitch and a hoe and da-da-da-da-da. I'm gonna be real. I went out and took a knife with me because like we have to talk about these things. We have to like address these things. These things are real. I loved when Michelle was talking about how like location is really important, right? So like I think transformative justice needs to be talked about and educated and learned. I do agree with what Joey said, what Byron said, and what Michelle said. I think it's a mixture of all those things, right? Moving on. One more question, y'all. What's something you want folks to know about our communities? Like, what is something that y'all think is missing? And what is something you want folks to know about our communities? Anyone can go. Muting.
I think for me, I think a lot about just how much of the influence that our communities have had on the world. I think specifically like trans people, um, and just how much influence trans people, Black trans people, and just trans people of color have had on the world in the art world and in the media and the music industry, in fashion, in in us getting to this place in this world. Like, people always use like the lump us in with the larger like LGBTQ plus acronym, but I never really even use like LGBTQ plus anymore, just because like our struggles are not the same. And so for me, it's like when I'm saying like, oh, talking about the issues specifically that trans people are facing, to say that, these are issues that LGBTQ plus people are facing is a disservice. And I think oftentimes like are lumped in. I think we need to be talking specifically about the specific issues that trans people are facing and understanding that LGB folks are at a very different place in the world than our communities are and our people are. Even though trans people have been at the forefront of so many different movements in this world, specifically around like fights for sexual orientation, like minorities and gender folks that are like dissident in terms of gender. And so I think a lot about that, and I think a lot about how people just co-opt like the wisdom of our community, the art and magic that folks bring into this world, and all we get is what we get right now, right? And so I just think a lot about like how folks can really commit to uplifting like trans voices and people, and whether that be hiring people for things, whether that be like housing someone, sending love someone's way, and just thinking about how we're committing to folks' survival and safety, like long term. Because, yeah, I don't know. I also think a lot about like, people like, like a huge reason why folks face so much violence and experience so much shit in the world is because like economic stability and not having access to money. And so I find that like when responses are like, oh, well, we can just like help trans people get jobs. Like, yes, like we could do that, but also like we shouldn't like, I don't know, but I just like hate work. I feel like folks just shouldn't have to work. And so I feel like, how are we creating like systems of support and stability for people that are going through so much, that where like they don't have to work, you know? So I just think about that a lot. And so, yeah.
Wait, you wanna go? You want me to go? Okay, I'll go. For me, oh, I forgot everything I was gonna say. In terms of, yeah, like I feel like that there's this narrative, right? That there's house arrest, or there's like police brutality, or that there's displacement, or just like different sorts of violence, right? That community space, and then there's like, oh, and then there's the LGBT component of that who experience it, and I feel like, I've experienced that in different spaces, which is why, you know, I've always chosen to go at different places and work with different people, right? So it's important to understand that, yeah, you know, like as folks who have been forced to the margins, at least for myself, in my experience growing up in LA, being queer, being part of an immigrant community, and community that constantly has faced displacement, right? It was important to be like, these are the people at the forefront, right? Like seeing trans girls, trans communities, like these were the people at the margins, at the like anytime some shit went down, like those are the people that have managed to figure out ways to survive, right? And we see it during COVID, right? With Chella, we've been able to reimagine or push back what protesting looked like, what organizing looked like, what activism looked like, right? At least for myself, right, as someone that enjoys creating arts and doing different political work outside of what we traditionally think of as activism or political work, right, through arts or through music or just through fucking shit up. You know, like before, if I ever wanted to do an event, it's like, where are we going to find a venue? How are we going to get people there? How are we going to do all these X, Y, and Z's, right? And because, again, it was like immigrant, queer, trans folks just trying to like hustle and make shit work, right? We're used to that. So now it's like, well, we don't need a fucking stage because no one has a stage. No one has access to space. So we're able to take the streets, queer the fuck out and just say like, yeah, you can think about this is what affects the LGBT community, or you can just actively support people doing the work, and just, you know, existing outside of those constraints. So that's all I was going to close with.
This is a really hard question for me because there's just so much you can say. I think one of the things I think one of the things I would like people to do is to demystify certain communities. I think when people see, you know, trans women on the street, there's this mysticism that also occurs where it's like the staring occurs, like the, whoa, like this is a trans person. And in reality, a lot of us just want to be invisible. Just kind of want to walk the street, just not being so focused, you know. And me being someone, you know, with a long braid, people, you know, look at me a lot, and then they expect me to be kind of like an Indian whisperer where they'll ask me questions about random tribes. And I come from one specific community with a very specific historical context. I'm not going to know if a white person opens up a Wikipedia page about some random tribe, they know more than me about that random tribe at that point, because there's just so much history even with LGBT people and indigeneity and things like that. So I think the mysticism is one of the things I want people to kind of stop, you know, when it comes to trans people, LGBT people, and indigenous people. I also want people to stop homogenizing so many people. You know, the American like LGBT movement, oftentimes pushing rainbow capitalism, is something I'm not really going to relate to, because in my community, that's not something that we push for. We push for other things, right? So I don't look at the LGBT movements in the United States as something I can relate to. And you know, that's because they have their own movements that they want to push for, and I just don't necessarily agree with all of them. And so I feel like we need to stop homogenizing so many people, but at the same time, I understand why people do it, because you know, where there's power in numbers. And so if I'm in the LGBT spectrum, then, you know, there's more me, you know, there's so little be housed in the United States that, you know, I can't really fight for our community here in the United States unless I'm in the whole indigenous umbrella. And so recognize that, yes, we're under these umbrellas, but also we're individuals. We also come from specific communities. You know, trans women of color don't go through the same things that white trans people go through. Same thing as indigenous people from the third world country don't go through the same things that Native people from a first world country go through. And even with migration, there's migration privileges. Here, I live in Miami, there's Cuban migrants here, and, you know, they had a lot of migrant privileges, and now they're expected to represent the undocumented communities here in South Florida. And a lot of them are Republican, and they're like, well, you know, Biden doesn't understand the undocumented immigrant struggle, but neither do these Cubans here in Miami, because they have immigration privileges. And so what do I have to do with people who've never had to fear the police? You know, these communities teach their kids to call the police when there's trouble. In my family, we're taught never to call the police no matter what, to never call the police. That just wasn't an option because of fear of deportation. And my family members have been deported multiple times. My dad's been deported 3 times, and my mother's been deported, and they both went to prison. And so the things that I've been through is very specific. And I'm not going to relate to every single person in my community, not just my community, but other umbrella terms that I may exist in. And so not to homogenize so many people, recognize that, yeah, we come from communities, but to not expect us to be the voice for every single identity that exists. I can't speak for all trans people. I can't speak for all gay people. And I definitely can't speak for all Indians. That's just impossible.
I can. I'm totally joking. Let's laugh. Let's breathe. Yeah, we can laugh. Here's something I really want to talk about. Want to say. People know me. Give us our roses while we're still fucking here. You know what I mean? Don't wait until we die and say, oh, Michelle did an amazing job. They used to be an amazing organizer. No, give them their roses now, right? We can't smell them when we're dead. That's what I'm gonna say with that. Okay, we're opening the room for questions on the panelists. You can send the messages here, or we can unmute you when you need to ask a question. But while you ask those questions and get ready for that, I do want to read a poem real quick. This month is Audre Lorde's birthday on the 18th, the same as mine. And y'all, this is my favorite poem. And I want to read it to y'all because I, have that space to do that. It's the Litany for Survival. For those of us who live at the shoreline, standing upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone. For those of us who cannot indulge the passing dreams of choice, who love in doorways coming and going, in the hours between dawns, looking inward and outward at once before and after, seeking a now that can breed future, like bread in our children's mouths, so their dreams will not reflect the death of ours. For those of us who were imprinted with fear, like a faint line in the center of our foreheads, learning to be afraid with our mother's milk, for by this weapon, this illusion of some safety to be found. The heavy-footed hope to silence us, for all of us. This instant and this triumph, we were never meant to survive. And when the sun rises, we are afraid it may not remain. And when the sun sets, we are afraid it might not raise in the morning. And when our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. When our stomachs are empty, we are afraid we may never eat again. When we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we remain silent, we are still afraid. So it's better to speak remembering we were never meant to survive. Audrey Lord, y'all. Audrey fucking Lord, happy birthday. Um, I love that poem, y'all. I just love that poem. I heard it, during the uprising of Trayvon Martin. Okay, what are the questions? Did any questions come to you, Hamid?
Let me see.
Nope, if there are no questions, I'm joking.
I have a question. And this is just more a conversational piece to.
I have to go get some tissue real quick. I'll be right back.
Sure. Thank you, Chella. So for Joey, Michelle, Byron, or anybody else, the participation. So the work the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition does is around surveillance, spying, and infiltration, and kind of just taking it beyond the general conventional understanding of surveillance or claim of surveillance, which is very limiting, that it's an invasion of privacy only. Well, yeah, it is an invasion of privacy, but the way we have been mapping it out, that it is so pervasive and it is so massive that it is really, it gets weaponized with the intent to cause harm. To cause harm to various communities, to cause harm to immigrants, to cause harm to youth, to cause harm to the Black community, to cause harm to the Indigenous community. And surveillance has been around forever. I mean, this has been a tactic. So I just wanted to see, just for understanding, for the coalition's understanding as well, that in your own communities, that how do you all see surveillance playing out and data collection playing out?
Yeah, I think about this a lot, and I think it kind of speaks to kind of like the conversation that we had earlier around oh, I'm like blanking right now, but the conversation we were having around people feeling um progress is being made when it's actually like more harmful to our communities. I think about specifically like data collection, right? And people like on the census and state data collection and county data collection, like people are always trying to advocate, or specifically in our communities, I've heard people try to advocate for, with the police, like, oh, like the police just need more training so they can be more culturally competent on how to work with trans people, right? But like, no, like that isn't the solution to anything, because it's actually going to just funnel more resources back into the police. And nothing's actually going to change. So I think about like data collection too, and just like how people want these statistics and demographics to be listed like on local, state, and national forms and things like that, which I understand is like good, like, or seemingly good, because people want to be counted and people want to be acknowledged as like a trans person, or as someone that is no longer invisibilized by the state. Because when there are no numbers of our community, then people ignore our issues. And unfortunately, things like statistics and data, like that's what people take seriously when it comes to like change, at least when it comes to like the government and things like that. So I think a lot about that, but I also think about how that opens up doors for, communities to be targeted, and to be, how folks open up um, opportunities for surveillance and harm, and more harm to happen. Like if we know where trans people are living, or like, because there are certain areas of the city, that trans people like live in and have, and I think that they already do that, like where trans sex workers are located, like police knows where those areas are and are constantly surveilling those areas. And so I think about like with other forms of data collection that's facilitated by the state, what kind of harms that can create for our people. But I also do understand the want and need for more like data and statistics for our communities too. But I think that that needs to be really like carried out by our own people too. And so I think that it can totally be separate from the state and all of those different things. But I think that's the first thing that comes to mind when I think about that, because it's definitely like always an issue, because we want people to know and like prove that what our community is going through is actually a real issue by showing, you know, like 130,000 people are like trans people are houseless, but at the same time, like, how is that creating just like, how is that harmful? So that's the first, like, what comes to mind right now.
Thank you, Michelle. Joey?
Just to be sure, you're asking like how do we feel about surveillance and things like that?
How do you feel about surveillance? How do you feel like in your own community and where you're at? How is it playing out? And how many different ways?
So I'll say this from my family perspective, a lot of my family members are very distrusting of the state in general. That could be from just historical context, how we view for the country that we come from, or how we view how technology has been used against us and things like that. And so none of my family members have social media except for me, because they're that distrusting of it. I have elders that will call me and say, hey, I need to talk to you. And then they'll hang up. And then I have to drive to their place. And then they'll make me put my phone in a different room. And then they'll talk to me. And then I'm kind of like a nihilist when it comes to that. I feel like if the government is trying to find information from me, they're going to find it one way or another. So I can't really stop it. And so that's just my perspective. But my family definitely is very much paranoid. Just because they'll say that, look, I hear things like you talk about dog food and now you're getting ads for dog food. You know, they don't like Google being implemented in the houses here. Now, my family members back home, because they live in a village, they don't even have like internet or Wi-Fi, so it's not necessarily a problem there. But definitely my family or my community members that live in the cities are definitely paranoid of how surveillance is playing out, because they just feel like everything is an invasion of privacy. Even me just having a Facebook, my mom makes fun of me because she's like, oh, you're there putting all your thoughts for everyone to see. The government can see that, they can read that, you know. And I just tell her, like, I'm just some random person. They don't care who I am. But the way my family members and my community see surveillance is very much like on the paranoia scale.
Pardon, any thoughts?
I was just gonna quickly say, you know, for me is like queerness had always been about reimagining or rethinking who I could be, right? And I feel like we should be doing that, right? As a community, as queerness, at least for me, pushing back, right? So as Holly was mentioning, right, like, and even Michelle, around like collecting data about like ourselves and our bodies, right? So if you look at like the DACA recipient database that was created through DACA, right? And just looking at like our communities have constantly been like surveillance and police. And I think someone earlier meant or briefly touch up on or even the ways that we police ourselves, right? So, or police our own communities, just because of our experiences of what we think, or when we have like, someone may have told us, right? So for me, it's important. How do we re-envision living our lives or supporting each other without regenerating the states, right? Or like replicating patriarchal behaviors in ourselves, right? Like policing how we should behave or speak or act or dress, and all those things. And just like be able to rethink and be like, well, just because we know a place where, you know, like, for example, right? Like DACA recipients or just like anyone else that has lived in this country for a longer period of time, they'll tell you like, well, now it's about safety, right? So it's like, how do we compromise or give more tools to the state to know about who we are and how we move and what it chooses to do with our bodies, right? Under the notion of, oh, well, it's safe, it will make everyone else feel safer. So for me, it's just definitely, you know, questioning it and rethinking different ways we can live and exist.
Thank you. Yeah.
Can I answer as well?
Yes, please.
I mean, especially living in Skid Row, as you know, since you know a lot of these things, we do see the laser situation happening. We do see also, like, I think about benefits, right? We were talking when we started this conversation a few years ago around like benefits, right? When you sign up for benefits, that's being recorded. When you sign up for government housing, don't get it twisted, motherfuckers. I live in a government housing situation. So like it literally, like, they track to see if you're taking your meds, they track to see if you're You know, your senior therapist that like, if you're like healthy, if you're not healthy, they track it all. And all of it is a need, right? Like I need this place because without this place, I'd be homeless. You know, because I cannot find a place to live in LA that's what I pay and what I get, you know? That being said, I also see things like I said around mental health, especially when people have mental breakdowns, right? I see it especially when folks they used to use there was I think Shakir said it last week around like there was a relationship. There was even a grant that was given where pretty much cops can come up to my apartment complex and use it to spy on motherfuckers and like literally go and arrest them when they're selling drugs or when they're doing crime. So those kind of things. I agree with what Byron said though, like we should reimagine ourselves and reimagine this world, but I also see it as, but with that, not but, and with that, I also see the surveillance happening. And yeah, and don't get it twisted. We are being recorded and we are being listened to. So this conversation is real. Yeah. But yeah, thank you, Hamid, for asking that question.
Yeah, and I just quickly want to follow up because Joey, you said something because this is so we released a report about back in September on information sharing and surveillance in the Department of Children and Family Services, which is a public sector, public department at the LA County. And what we found was the scale of data collection that everywhere, all of these agencies are constantly moving. And the report's on our website too. This is one page of just the information sharing part of it. That it is that, families are going in for services. Families are going in because they need food, they need shelter, they need support for children. But yet at the same time, the scale and the level of information. So this is where obviously making your point that this is so pervasive and just something that Chella was also sharing that about the benefit side of it. So yeah, I believe I'm so I hope I don't mispronounce your name, Sarah. So let me just please go ahead and unmute. Yes.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gira Flores. I'm with Transcorp Pueblo. So one of the things that I heard Hoey mentioned about is around comfort. And I think in my head, so I wanted to know like what, I'm not sure I have like a specific question, but like, I guess around my question is like the politics of comfort and pleasure in relationship to punishment and how like you see this if you see any distinctions between like comfort and like, I guess the ways that like the government provides, the way that like institutions work. I'm super sorry if that's like unclear as hell, but like I'm just thinking of this like question in this like very gray blob of like, I want to understand like what are your understandings of like pleasure, comfort, and punishment, I guess. Thank you.
So I'm not super sure that this is your question, so I hope I can give you my perspective. But for example, I'll say this: before migrating to the United States, in Colombia where I lived, we didn't have a roof. We didn't have electricity. When it would rain, we would sweep the water out of our house. We were poor, right? Then I migrated to the United States with my mother, and we lived in a 1-bedroom apartment with me, my mom, and my brother. And we had a water heater. Before we would have to bathe in buckets, now we have a water heater. We had air conditioner. We had a room it was for us 3, but I thought we became rich when I migrated here. I genuinely thought we had a lot of money because we had all these things. And it's not that when I was growing up, I was aware that we were poor. I just had a reality, and I knew that rich people were able to enjoy certain things. We were still poor in the United States, but now we achieved a first world poor where we had access to certain things that we just didn't have access before. Now, for example, now I live in a place that is gated, and I'm still poor, and yet we live in a gated community. And so many things I'm able to do, even though I'm poor. Whenever I go back to my community, they talk to me like I'm rich. They're like, "Oh, the rich guy is back," because that's their perception of me, right? And that is the perception I had of me as well when I first migrated here. And so there are certain things that I'm able to do. For example, I'm able to go to a supermarket and buy groceries, which not everyone in the United States is able to do. But I lived in a community in the United States where there was Walmart nearby. I can go and go to Walmart and buy groceries, Back home, a lot of the food we got was either grown, like I had to grow my own yuca to eat, right? Or, we will go to neighboring communities and buy food, And so there was just certain things that were not. Now I'm able to give money to a company that relies on undocumented immigrants to pick those foods. And so I can ignore that, right? To this day, I can go to these companies like Publix. It's a South Florida brand, or business, and now I can give money to this corporation that pays little to undocumented immigrants. And most people aren't thinking about this stuff when we go to these corporations. And so this is in one way where I'm able to achieve a certain comfort, where now I don't have to grow my own food. Now I can go and buy food from a market, a corporation that exploits people, and that's just one aspect, food, right? Now I have certain access to certain water, I have certain access to certain transportation. And where do these resources are coming from? I live in a first world country now. Even though I'm poor, I can still achieve certain things. I have, internet, things like that. Where in a third world country, my family just doesn't have. I haven't talked since COVID. I have not talked to a lot of my family members back home because they don't have. They used to migrate to a city, to get certain supplies and migrate back. They can't do that because of COVID, right? However, I can still talk to Chella, even though COVID's happening, right? And so there's just certain comfort that I find here in this first world. And me migrating here, if I didn't have the morals that I had, I can just forget about my community back home. I could just stop relating to them. I could just fully assimilate to Americanness and enjoy the pillaging that is doing in the third world. And so and I hope I answered your question, but that's what I mean by comfort. And so I'm able to ignore the punishment that the United States is doing to my home country because I live here. I can just disconnect and I can just fully enjoy it. Can you put it over there, please? Sorry. Sorry about that. But yeah, so so that is what I mean by comfort, and just kind of, again, being able to enjoy a first world life that I just did not have, that my family members don't have back home. It's just really different. I hope I was able to answer your question. If not, then if you can clarify.
Oh, great. I'm able to unmute myself again. Great. No, I guess it's more around like, thank you so much for all that, because I do definitely understand that. I also come from like the, that kind of community where it's like you bathe with like a bucket and you have to heat it up with like logs and things like that. But I guess in my head, there exists, I think, this idea around the way, I think, like a way in which comfort like transforms you into like a passive receptacle for like all these like harmful and destructive ideas that that society places, right? Like, so you come to the United States and you're essentially like allowed, you know, hot water, internet, all these things that are like super available. And in place, right, you allow yourself to be molded and sculpted into accepting that, like, oh, because X thing is true, then Y truth of X government. Oh, no, anyway, like the truth of the government is like the truth of the society, the situation. And also then the way in which, I guess, pleasure, like the pleasure of being like queer, being trans, of being two-spirit, or being third gender. Like because like one of the things that I think really like did come out was that a lot of our people do have these, like, they just don't understand that, like, oh, a trans woman is a woman. Doesn't matter what like body parts she has, a trans woman is a woman. Because for even sometimes before colonization, we just thought of it in binary ways. But like, no, yeah, I was like just thinking of like, how does, oh, I'm like super sorry. I have no idea how to like concretely make this this gray idea into a reality and a question. I feel like that really bad news reporter at the White House.
I really wish I could answer. I'm sorry. I really wish I understood, but I don't know. Like, I will say that I have met people that migrate here, attain these resources, and then assimilate to the idea that, of course, this country is doing, like, the government this country has is amazing, therefore I can afford all these things down here, as opposed to in the third world where I'm not able to because of the government over there is so socialistic or so non-individualistic. Here, society pushes you to be individualistic, and so now you're able to have all these things. I have problems with all these ways of thinking, and I it's just from like my family teaching me differently, and to like kind of resist assimilation, whether it's through language. You know, just don't just speak Spanish and English. You know, speak Runashimi. You know, that's our language, that's our maternal language, so we need to speak it. You know, and so just through the anti-assimilation movement that my family participates with me, or enforces with me, I'm able to look at the government of the United States and see that, well, we're doing so well here in the United States, and so many people are doing so well because of the resources they steal. And so I'm really just against that. And again, I don't know if that was your question, but I think that we shouldn't look at the government and see that because we have all these resources, it means that this government is successful, because there is no first world country today that didn't rely on slavery and genocide of its local people.
Any other questions from folks? I don't see any other questions or comments, Chella.
Yay. I mean, we did it, y'all. I mean, is there anything I want to say? Joey, Byron?
No, I'm good. Thank you, though, Chella, for inviting my voice into this space. Real grateful. Feel like I'm a little bit my mind is a little bit checked out for the night. I've been like,
well, don't worry, we're about to end.
No, I'm just being honest and transparent about where
Me
I'm
too.
at. I don't have a whole lot more to say.
As y'all see, I'm doing stuff here because I'm ADD. Come on. Yeah. Yeah. What about you, Hoey?
I feel like I take up so much space. I'm sorry, y'all. But
No,
what
you're
I
good. You're good. Go ahead.
but what I want to say is you know, just continue fighting for the local communities. Don't just look at what's happening in other states, but really fight for the local communities that know what their communities need, as well as also understand how politics don't just affect within these borders. Politics will always affect, unfortunately, other countries, and then that in turn affects local communities there. And so while one politician may seem amazing here, don't forget about the countries that are being taken advantage of. Always think, especially if you're an immigrant, especially if you come from somewhere else, never forget about your homelands. Because if you're taking resources here, if you're taking resources from there and you're living here and you wish to assimilate, or what you're asking for is just to be able to ignore the bones of your motherland. And that's something that I refuse to do.
Byron.
I was just gonna say thank you, Chella, for working on this, putting this together, and yeah, I think it's important, as you always mention, as the work that you always do around centering different voices, different folks. Whether that's anti-police work, anti-police surveillance board, like abolishing the police work, right? How do we abolish the police within ourselves that other folks have shared, in the past or spoken about in regards to, right? As we abolish the police and just the different, like the different ways that we surveil each other, that we just like even surveil ourselves, right? So for me, it's important for that. So thank you, Chella, and I'm glad to be able to support you doing this amazing work, having these conversations, facilitating spaces. So thank you.
So that being said, this has been thank y'all for coming. Hamid, I do have an announcement. But...
Go ahead, then I'll follow up with our next Tuesday stuff.
Okay, so announcement is March the 5th, which is a Friday. We are taking over somewhere else. I'm not going to say where. We don't know where yet. Just put it in y'all calendars. March the 5th. It is a Friday. Yeah, we're going to take over somewhere. I'm excited about it. Yeah, that's all I'm going to say.
We will be announcing that as well and updating people as we get closer to March 5th.
Yes, we will have calls. We will have Zoom calls to make sure that to get things running.
Absolutely. So, and thank you, Jella, again for that beautiful facilitation and your presence and your power. And I also want to just also share that this space is for everybody. So Byron, Joey, Michelle. If you all ever want to, just like this first Tuesday of the month is absolutely open and available, just to want to have a conversation, organize a conversation, whatever needs to be organized. Absolutely, it's for the community to participate and use. So thank you again. Our next second Tuesday, which will be on the 9th, is the intersection on the national security police state and the war on youth, as to how the youth are being impacted, how they're bringing up this whole national security language to further criminalize youth and this language of radicalization and extremism and everything else. So join us. It's going to be, the information is going to be posted on the website, stoplapdspying.org. And it'll be from 6 to 8, again, Pacific time in Los Angeles. So thank you all very much. And this will be posted on our website. The recording, hopefully it should be up. This is webinar 45, so it should be up by Friday or Saturday at the latest. So check it out. But thank you all very much. Be safe and be healthy. And thank you again for making this space so powerful and interactive. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Good night.